the International Operations Subcommittee of the Committee on Government Operations in the United States House of Representatives presents a report, Relief and Rehabilitation in Korea. The published version of this report was approved by the Committee on Government Operations on July the 21st, 1954, and printed as House Report number 2574. This film version of that report was produced by the United States Information Agency with the cooperation of government agencies, including the Department of State and the Motion Picture Branch of the United States Army Signal Corps. This report can be traced to President Eisenhower's special message to Congress nearly a year before, when he requested an additional $200 million for South Korean relief and rehabilitation. The money was to come from savings resulting from the termination of hostilities. The President said, "This government has been constantly aware that all that has been won by this valiant struggle could be imperiled and lost by an economic collapse. Poverty and despair could inflict wounds beyond the power of enemy guns." As soon as Congress approved the President's request, the International Operations Subcommittee, under its chairman, Charles B. Brownson of Indiana, voted to make a study of this program on the site of actual operations in Korea. Members of the International Operations Subcommittee at this time included Congresswoman Catherine St. George of New York, Congressman George Meader of Michigan, Congressman Bill Lantaff of Florida, Congressman Lester Holtzman of New York, Congressman Judd of Minnesota, and Dodd of Connecticut. This subcommittee has the task of examining the efficiency and economy in the international operations of our government. Before leaving for overseas, the subcommittee spent weeks assembling information on Korean problems. Many government departments and informed private agencies were consulted. In these extensive briefings, particular attention was directed toward an analysis of the political history and the economic geography of Korea. The little land of Korea, ancient battleground of Oriental conquerors, for centuries withdrawn, the hermit kingdom of the Far East, in modern times, for 40 years, a Japanese possession whose economic development was sacrificed to the needs of foreign empire. In the closing years of World War II, Korea's meager resources of minerals, cotton, and grain were systematically exploited to meet demands of the desperate Japanese war machine. Under Japanese rule, supervisory positions and jobs requiring technical knowledge were reserved exclusively for Japanese. With the Allied victory, the repatriation of these technicians left the Korean economy paralyzed. Into this depleted land, the United States Army moved in 1945. Military government was faced with unusual problems. Korea was artificially split at the 38th parallel, a line arbitrarily drawn on the map, without regard for natural boundaries or economic realities. In North Korea were located 66% of the industry and 90% of the hydroelectric power, as well as most of the known coal, iron, and other mineral deposits of major importance. South Korea, whose economy had complemented that of the North, was cut off from minerals and power, but had 75% of the agriculture and 2/3 of all of the people. Confronted with this unrealistic situation, military government sought to reshape the abruptly isolated economy until Korea could be unified. The United States supplied $378 million worth of economic aid. Systematic public health measures such as dustings with DDT were introduced to combat typhus, typhoid, smallpox, and other contagious diseases which had reached epidemic proportions. The United States Army worked closely with the South Koreans to clean out centers of communist conspiracy and to quell communist-inspired riots. Meanwhile, Through negotiations in Seoul, the Russians blocked every United States effort to unify Korea. Following this communist breach of faith, free elections were held in South Korea. On August the 15th, 1948, the Republic of Korea was established, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. The birth of the new republic brought an end to military government, but United States aid continued. $170 million worth of machinery and supplies were shipped into Korea during the next 22 months, just as signs of economic stability encouraged the people of the new independent Korea after their long bondage and servitude under Japan. June 25th, 1950, war struck from the north, unprovoked and with little warning. The North Korean forces launched a bloody and destructive invasion of peaceful South Korea. Efforts toward economic recovery were impossible as volunteers answered the call to repel the invaders and defend the Republic. United States and United Nations troops and airmen fought side by side with the ROK forces. Tragic victims of the savage communist aggression were the civilians of the Republic of Korea. Thousands of uprooted refugees surged southward. There was crucial need for emergency civilian assistance. A staggering setback followed initial successes when Mao and his Red Chinese openly joined the war. Endless hordes were flung against the tiny land of the south. For 3 long years, the war continued, wreaking havoc, destruction, and death. In July 1951, on direct word from Moscow, the communists professed a desire to discuss a truce. 22 months of delays, frustrations, and inconclusive haggling followed. Not until March 1953 at Panmunjom did negotiations take the decisive turn which led to the signing of the truce on July 27th. The terrible futility of the communist aggression against South Korea became all too evident. On this armistice map, the truce line finds the Reds halted nearly where they started. They actually lost some ground. Between the end of World War II and the truce, United States economic aid to Korea was well over $1 billion. In addition, over $22 million were contributed by U.S. voluntary agencies, and over $55 million by other nations. Thus, the United States contributed over 95% of all economic aid to Korea. War had exacted a fearful toll. Seoul, the capital, once a proud city of over 1 million, was in ruins. But Seoul was not alone. Of South Korea's 95 larger cities, 58 suffered major war damage. 50 to 60% of all factories damaged or completely gutted. 3 out of every 5 bridges were demolished or damaged almost beyond repair. Important yards of the vital railway system, repair shops, rolling stock were in ruins. In Seoul alone, 250,000 houses damaged, 500,000 houses destroyed. 3.5 million refugees, 50,000 homeless orphans, millions hungry, thousands upon thousands of wounded in makeshift hospitals. The dead numbered over 1 million. These grim facts and many more were studied by the subcommittee and compiled into 2 manuals for each member to use on the trip abroad. On September 29, 1953, the International Operations Subcommittee, its staff and escort officer, boarded a regularly scheduled military air transport service plane in Washington on the first leg of its 19,000-mile mission to the Far East. Frequent conferences were held en route to the committee's first hearing in Japan. State Department Escort Officer Belton Bryan checked details with Committee Staff Director Maurice Mountain. The chairman reviewed plans with Staff Counsel Edward C. Kennelly. The committee's first meeting in Tokyo was scheduled at Pershing Heights, the headquarters of the United States Far East Command and the United Nations Command. After conferring with General John Hull, the Supreme U.S. and UN Commander, the committee began hearings in this headquarters, which controls field operations for the relief and rehabilitation of Korea. Comprehensive briefings were opened by Admiral B. Hall Hanlon, top Civil Affairs Staff Officer to General Hull, his deputy, Colonel Louis Gosshorn, and other officers of the J-5 section, each a specialist in his particular field of activity. South Korea is a land almost exactly the size of the state of Indiana, but with 5.5 times as many people. Comparisons of annual production tell another story. In Korea, mining output is $17 million. Indiana, 10 times as much. Korean agriculture nets $660 million a year. Indiana, about double that. Korean manufacturing, $144 million. Indiana, $4.5 billion. The committee found that the objective of the present rehabilitation program is to develop in South Korea a workable economy, capable, without substantial outside help, of supporting a standard of living about equal to that of 1949, Korea's best year, when the average annual income per person was $90. It is also deemed necessary for the economy to support a military force adequate to deter external aggression by minor military powers. Although the figure of 20 divisions was frequently heard, it was emphasized that military needs will vary with the situation. For fiscal year 1954, the planned aid budget was $628 million, of which the Republic of Korea was to supply 19%, or $122 million. United States and United Nations aid would supply 81%, or $506 million. The committee noted that present estimates indicate that an additional $1 billion or more will be required over the next 4 years. In this 21 hours of hearings, the committee examined 3 crucial aspects of the program. First, the existing administrative structure. Second, plans for increasing Korean production. Third, measures to fight inflation. Military and political matters were considered entirely in this light. Information developed at the hearings was carefully recorded for future use. With the close of these hearings in Japan, the committee added the information developed from General Hull and his staff to the extensive background material obtained in Washington. Early on the morning of October the 12th, the committee left by plane for Korea to make its on-the-ground appraisal of the relief and rehabilitation program. From the air, the rugged nature of Korea becomes immediately apparent. Sawtooth Mountains in endless parade are desolate and forbidding. 3/4 of the land is mountainous. Once the slopes were thick with trees. Now they are almost naked. In the narrow and broken valleys, Korean farmers work to supply the food for 22 million people. Yet only 23% of the land is arable. Landing at the Seoul airport as they did, the committee was met by United States Ambassador to Korea, Ellis O. Briggs, Economic Coordinator C. Tyler Wood, and Mayor Kim, mayor of the special city of Seoul, as they call it. In sharp contrast to the harsh landscape is the historic cheerfulness and hospitality of these Korean people, who say appropriately, if you love your own children, love also those of others. Above the Capitol, the Korean flag newest banner in the family of nations, made up of some of the oldest symbols in the world. In Seoul, amidst the devastation, there were signs of gradual return to some kind of normal living. Some public transportation, intermittent electric power. Here, in cramped quarters near the ambassador's residence, was the forward echelon of the United States Embassy. Over half of the staff still remained in Busan. The role of the embassy in the rehabilitation program is chiefly advisory. Ambassador Briggs is kept fully informed of developments and, in turn, supplies general political orientation. The political situation in Korea has a controlling effect on the relief program. Possibilities of renewed hostilities, unification of North and South Korea, or continuation of the present division must be considered in determining the emphasis on long-range reconstruction. The committee went immediately to confer with President Syngman Rhee. The cooperative role of the Republic of Korea is obviously crucial to the success of the rehabilitation effort. The rugged determination and indomitable spirit of the Korean people under their patriot President Syngman Rhee is their great asset. The meager scale of their material resources demands most careful management by the Korean government. All but the most essential expenditures must be avoided if Korea's limited assets are to be used effectively in cooperation with aid program funds. This is one of the points of contention. Korean desires for rapid industrialization are understandable. Economic facts, however, must be reckoned with if sound growth, rather than a hastily applied veneer of industrialization, is to be the result. Top Korean authorities, such as Prime Minister Pak Tu-chin, frankly expressed the opinion that too much rehabilitation effort is directed toward controlling inflationary pressures and not enough toward providing heavy capital equipment. Korean officials obviously want more control over the use of outside aid funds without losing any of their authority over the expenditure of Korean funds. It is understandable but unfortunate that timely information concerning the economy has not always been available to U.S. and UN officials, as provided for in agreements with Korea. Complete participation of the ROK government is both a basic policy and an operational concept of importance. Mayor Kim Tae-sun, formerly Commissioner of Police of South Korea, briefed the committee on the problems of communist infiltration and the difficulties of administering a city in ruins crowded with homeless refugees. The congressman spent many hours listening to the views of Korean officials because they realized that their attitudes are important elements in the overall relief and rehabilitation program. Next came study of the answers to the 16 questions the committee had sent ahead from Washington. At the headquarters of C. Tyler Wood, General Hull's senior representative for economic affairs, the committee prepared for the testimony of United States and United Nations officials. Through Mr. Wood, the $200 million voted by the Congress will be spent. The core of the complex organization through which he works is fairly clear. General Hull is both United Nations and United States commander. On his staff is the economic coordinator. Field operations are carried out by the United Nations Korean Reconstruction Agency and the U.S. Army's Korean Civil Assistance Command. The Republic of Korea contributes some of its resources to the program, and a special device has been set up to develop common policies and plans. This device is the Combined Economic Board, composed of 2 members. Mr. C. Tyler Wood is the United Nations member representing General Hull. The Republic of Korea is represented by Pak Tu-chin, at the time of our visit, Korean Prime Minister. This board presents organizational problems. Although supposed to recommend a common policy, it acts only with difficulty. What President Rhee, on the one hand, will not agree to, the ROK member cannot recommend, and the use of Republic of Korea resources in a common effort is thus blocked. On the other hand, what the Unified Command cannot accept, the United Nations member cannot recommend, and the plan for coordinated use of funds for a common program is canceled. No problem demands greater coordination than the fight against the ruinous inflation which large-scale war brought to this tiny economy. The man in the street remembers that in 1940, 3 or 4 won was a day's pay. In 1951, 1,000 won bought a single pair. The normal balance between goods and money was upset as the value of Korean money shrank to 1/25 of its 1950 value. Although tons of consumer goods were imported and poured into the Korean economy, inflation continued. As a result, Korea experienced all the classic evils: price fluctuation, hoarding, destruction of the incentive to work and to invest, as well as black marketeering. The startling fourfold increase in the price of the basic Korean food rice between September 1951 and September 1952 affords a graphic picture of the dizzy course of inflation. There was a rapid increase in the supply of currency as the government resorted to printing press money. In 1952, prices rose about 10% a month. Some interest rates were 1% a day. Since the Korean farmer was able to feed himself, price rises did him little injury. It was on the city dweller who must buy his food that the brunt of inflation fell. In 3 years of military operations, the Korean government supplied local currency totaling 14 billion Korean won to the United Nations commander. This Korean money was used principally to pay Korean labor employed in the construction of bridges, roads, shelters, and other works needed for military operations, since the Korean government had been administratively unable to assume this task. For this 14 billion won, the United States paid Korea 176 million United States dollars, so Korea could import consumer goods as part of the fight against inflation. During hostilities, the Army imported more than $176 million worth of relief goods, but since most of these were distributed free and not sold, the excess Korean won still remained in circulation. Commodities must be sold on local markets at fair prices to halt inflation. But everyday prices on many items, like railroad fares, bear no relation to their value. Ordinary Koreans seldom get their rail tickets at the low government fixed prices. Speculators buy them up to sell at 10 times the legal rate. Government price fixing without enforcement is useless. The consumer gains nothing and speculators get the currency the government should collect and retire from circulation. Taxes in Korea, normally paid by the farmer in grain instead of money, have not been efficiently collected. Surpluses, which should go to feed city populations, have been largely consumed on the farm, delaying recovery. General John B. Coulter directs a large part of the task of increasing Korean production. He heads the United Nations Korean Reconstruction Agency, which shares with the Korean Civil Assistance Command responsibility for operations in the field. Agricultural production is one of South Korea's best hopes for self-sufficiency and foreign trade. Koreans are among the world's best farmers. In 1953, they enjoyed a bumper crop. Yet for 1954, a 17% increase is programmed, and over the next 2 years, a 57% increase in food production is the goal. After 1956, it is hoped Korea can become a net exporter of foods. Since arable land is limited, this means better yields from existing acreage. In 1954, over $34 million worth of chemical fertilizer was scheduled to replace the supplies formerly secured from the north. Limited water supply also restricts some Korean farming. By repairing and extending irrigation works, it is planned to add 840,000 acres, producing 360,000 long tons of food annually. 73% of South Korea is forest land. The forests, however, are being robbed because of the fuel shortage. 3 times the annual growth is cut each year. At this rate, it is estimated the forests will be all gone in 17 years. Authorities must act to stop this wholesale destruction of lumber and the forest soil itself. A program of reforestation, of supplying substitute fuels, and of honest policing of the forests is reportedly underway. Eventually, an annual yield of 22.5 million cubic meters is possible. Half of this will take care of Korean sawmills and industry. The other half will supply fuel. Fish is the most important source of protein for the Korean diet. Over the next 3 years, an increase of about 22% over the present catch of 296,000 long tons is expected. The most pressing need is for the repair and addition of facilities for handling the catch, including refrigeration equipment, salterns and canneries, as well as transport for expediting the movement of fish to inland markets. Brigadier General Homer Case commanding the United States Korean Civil Assistance Command, confirmed the committee's belief that the greatest single bottleneck in the rehabilitation program at the time was transportation. The wanton destruction of warfare piled on top of 20 years of poor maintenance left the 2,000-mile Korean National Railway system in poor condition. Our Army, which has been operating 1,200 miles of this system, has been forced to spend an average of $3 million each month to maintain only basic facilities. The only paved roads in all South Korea are the city streets of Seoul and Busan. The rest are badly maintained, unsurfaced highways. Korea's north-south transportation system was built primarily as a Japanese bridge to Manchuria and needs extensive additions. Coastal shipping supplies part of this need. 41,000 small boats are engaged in fishing and transport. To keep them going, Korea's one large shipyard at Busan and 30 smaller ones are being rehabilitated. The present program of relief and rehabilitation looks first to supplying immediate needs and to repairing and completing existing plants and equipment. For example, Korea once had a well-developed power system, but 2/3 of the generating capacity was in the north. War damage reduced the effectiveness of the remaining third to 90,000 kilowatts. South Korea could generate less power than the battleship Missouri. Over the next 5 years, it is planned to bring the capacity up to 225,000 kilowatts. Most of this will be obtained by repairing existing plants. In the field of public health, an impressive record has been compiled through the joint efforts of the Army Civil Assistance Command and UNCRA personnel. 17 schools for the training of Korean nurses and a Korean School of Public Health have been established. U.S. dollars voted in 1953 will provide for the rehabilitation of a medical school, a dental school, 3 quarantine stations, and 17 health centers. Before the outbreak of hostilities, there were 4,400 physicians in Korea. By the end of June 1954, the committee was told, there should be 6,000. Nearly 1/4 of these will be on duty with the armed forces. The success of Korean physicians working with United States and United Nations personnel is noteworthy. Spectacular results have been achieved since 1951 in the field of epidemic control. 28,000 immunizations and 25 million DDT applications have reduced typhus from 33,000 cases with 2,500 deaths in 1950 to 400 cases with 30 deaths in 1953. 31 million vaccinations have cut smallpox from 36,000 cases in 1951 to 3,000 in 1953. 27 million immunizations helped reduce typhoid from 75,000 cases in 1951 to 1,600 in 19... USIA's most effective medium is motion pictures. 565 films are available, many produced in Korea, some with sound locally recorded. One of the most popular films is Return to Freedom, filmed by USIA in Korea. A simple story of the nation's displaced people, typified by a homeless young man. It is a basic story, easily understood. A story designed to encourage Koreans to assist the refugees as they resettle and start anew, to farm the land from which they were driven by the invaders from the north. Each month, 2 million watch these films in culture centers and free showings. Another 1,700,000 see USIA films in Korea's 85 commercial movie theaters. USIA produces the only newsreel in Korea. This colorful scene is typical of the local coverage possible only through this medium.
선반 위의 장난감도 웃음을 참지 못할 지경입니다.
Unfortunately, many leading newspapers are published in a script that cannot be easily understood by the average Korean. However, locally produced USIA newsreels, narrated by native Koreans, inform the public of current events in a common language understood by all. These typical newsreel shots produced by the unit in Korea are examples of this medium which brings to all manner of people of all stations of life, in the cities, in the villages, on the farms. news of significant events in their own country. Democracy flourishes where the people are informed. A well-conducted information program is no luxury in Korea, where it is imperative that the United States enjoy full cooperation of the Koreans as free allies. USIA Korea operates on a small budget with only 17 American and 187 Korean employees.